My name is Renata Kokanovic, and I'm a director of the Social and Global Studies Center here at RMIT University. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Voi Wurrung and Bun Wurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin nations on whose unceded land we conduct our business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges the ancestors and elders past and present. RMIT also acknowledges the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. The United Nations mark International Women's Day each year as a time to reflect on the progress made, to call for change, and to celebrate the determination of women who have played an extraordinary role in the history of their countries and communities. In recognition that gender equality is an area requiring urgent attention both internationally and locally, International Women's Day 2021 campaign theme, Choose to Challenge, call for action to celebrate women's achievements, raise awareness against bias, and take actions for equality. It celebrates the remarkable efforts by women and girls around the world in shaping more equal futures. To address International Women's Day 2021 campaign's theme, I am pleased to welcome a esteemed panel of experts that came together to discuss citizenship, um, feminism and the digital era, including focusing on the gender-digital divide, COVID-19 and its effects and impacts, and feminist debates on gender, solidarity, difference, subjectivity, and intersectionality. I will now hand over to Associate Professor, Social and Global Studies co-research member Nicola Henry, who will introduce our esteemed panelists and provide a brief overview of the event. Nicola is a socio-legal scholar with over 20 years of research experience in the sexual violence field. Nicola is also author on numerous publications, including 6 monographs for leading academic publishers in her research field. Nicola also commenced her prestigious Australian Research Council Future Fellowship on Digital Platforms and Image-Based Sexual Abuse in early 2021. So welcome all, and Nicola, over to you.
Thank you so much, Renata. Before I begin, I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including their elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that today I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri land in the beautiful Shire of Nillumbik. Excuse me. We're recording today's event, so if you're not comfortable with being recorded, please keep your cameras turned off. I think someone may have their sound on, so can everyone please just check that you are currently on mute?
Now driving.
Okay, great. Someone was on a train, I think. That's normally me. So if we can just keep our cameras and microphones turned off while the presenters are speaking, that would be great. At the end of the event, I'll ask you to turn your cameras back on if you wish to. You're also welcome to use the chat function as well as use the Twitter hashtag IWD2021. So we all know that the past 2 weeks have been overwhelming and distressing. On social media, some people have actually queried whether we should cancel International Women's Day this year. And there's been much despair about how little we have to celebrate owing to the events of the past few weeks in Australian politics. This has shown to many of us that not much progress has been made at all in 2021 in terms of preventing sexual violence from occurring in the first place, or from hearing the victim survivor experiences of sexual violence. So typical of me, always an optimist at heart, but with some small streaks of pessimism, I would like to say that yes, we do have a lot to despair about, including the gender pay gap, the underrepresentation of women, particularly diverse women in Parliament and other positions, the worsening of gender and other social inequalities due to COVID-19, and of course the high prevalence of sexual and domestic violence, both online and offline. But we also have a lot to celebrate as well. In my lifetime, I've not seen this kind of outpouring of support for survivors of sexual violence, nor have I seen this kind of outrage. This year's theme for International Women's Day is Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. Before I pass over to the panellists though, I just have a few words to say about leadership. At home, we get the subscription to the Saturday paper, which arrives every Saturday morning, and we mostly get that to do the cryptic crosswords by the late Mungo McCallum. In the weekend, while I was having my cup of tea and breakfast, and after a terrible 2 weeks of depressing news, I had a few really great laugh out loud moments reading this paper. When I got to the Gadfly column written by Sami Shah, a comedian, writer and journalist, I knew I had to use his words today to sum up the current state of leadership, or lack thereof, in relation to the federal government. So I'll now read out what Shah said about politics, rape and leadership. So Sami Shah starts his column in the Saturday paper by describing how things should have gone last week as far as the leadership was concerned. Quote, this is how things should have gone. The Prime Minister is alerted to Brittany Higgins' alleged rape and right away makes a statement about how he's distraught over what she went through. He says he'll make sure this never happens again and will do everything in his power to see she has access to the resources needed for justice to be served. Then a few days later, when allegations of historical rape made against a cabinet minister come to light, the Prime Minister steps up and says he's doing everything in his power to find out what's alleged to have happened. The accused parliamentarian has been asked to step down until the police decide about an investigation. The Prime Minister demands an overhaul of the toxic culture of Canberra. He's clearly sincere in his efforts to shirt front toxic misogyny and rape culture, the public thinks, and we applaud him for his empathy and his concern. But Sami Shah then describes how things actually played out in practice. Scott Morrison couldn't bring himself to care about Brittany Higgins until Jenny told him he should, a conversation that Jenny seemingly hadn't had with him before, which makes you wonder how often he and Jenny actually talk. Then, when allegations of a historical rape are brought against a cabinet minister, Scott Morrison addressed the media only briefly while tossing the Royal Commission into Aged Care Quality and Safety report at them, like Batman throwing a smoke bomb, before disappearing. In that press conference, Scott Morrison admitted he was aware of the rumours of the alleged assault earlier this year, and so clearly had enough time to run them by Jenny, but didn't. Scott Morrison also said he hadn't read the documents outlining the allegations, but had spoken to the accused cabinet minister who had vigorously rejected the claims. Apparently vigorously rejecting any claims is all a person needs to do for the Prime Minister to believe their denial, end quote. So when we think about leadership, many of us imagine Prime Ministers, Cabinet Ministers, Commissioners, CEOs, managers, professors and Vice-Chancellors, Sergeants, Generals and Captains. But this week and last week, we've seen some atrocious examples of leadership, not just from the Prime Minister. The Cabinet Minister, Linda Reynolds, calling a rape victim a lying cow. The Australian Defence Force Chief advising female cadets that in order not to be raped, they should avoid alcohol, being out late at night, being out alone and being attractive. And a magistrate describing a rape victim as having buyer's remorse when she called a sexual assault crisis line the morning after her rape. Putting aside those dreadful and harmful comments and actions from those actually informal leadership positions, I say we should celebrate this International Women's Day. We should celebrate the other forms of leadership that we are seeing that is truly paving the way for real change right now. And these are the extraordinary, ordinary people who are standing up and courageously telling their stories. They include names like Dania, Mani, Grace Tame, Brittany Higgins, Catherine Thornton, Chantal Contos and Rosie Batty. Their dignity, integrity and their courage is, I think, something worth celebrating. And also worth celebrating is our amazing panel today. So without further ado, I will introduce each of them briefly. Our first speaker today is Steph Bassel. Steph will be speaking today about why a feminist approach to digital citizenship is important. Steph is a PhD candidate in the Social and Global Studies Centre at RMIT University. Her PhD examines how women with insecure migration status experience and seek help for family violence in Australia. She's been undertaking research on immigrant and refugee women's experiences of technology-facilitated abuse and also feminist approaches to digital citizenship. Our second speaker, all the way from the UK, which I believe is probably about 10 o'clock at night, so thank you, is Farnoosh Gadari, who'll be speaking about the Me Too movement and the Global South. Farnoosh is a lecturer in law in at London South Bank University. She is currently completing her PhD in law at King's College, London. Farnoosh's research focuses on the intersection of feminist legal theory and international law, and she's interested in the use of alternative, non-hegemonic epistemologies and discourses for the promotion of women's rights, particularly in the Global South. Our third speaker is Dr. Bianca Faleborn. Bianca will be speaking today about digital activism and the role of digital platforms in seeking justice for victims, survivors of harassment, abuse and violence. Bianca is a senior lecturer in criminology in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Her work is broadly concerned with interrogating the intersections of identity, space, culture and experiences of violence. And our fourth and final speaker is Dr. Jenny Kennedy. Jenny will be speaking about gender, artificial intelligence, design and digital cultures. Jenny is an ARC DECRA Fellow in Media and Communications at RMIT University. Her projects focus on digital exclusion of low-income populations and the gendering of AI and automation in home environments. Each panellist will speak for 10 minutes and then we'll follow up with a couple of questions for me before opening it up to the rest of the audience for you to ask your questions. So over to you, Steph.
Thanks, Nicola. So just wait for my slides, sorry. So I would like to begin by acknowledging and paying my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians on the land of which I'm speaking today, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So today I'll be speaking about digital citizenship and feminism, and my presentation is based on a co-authored paper with Nicola and our colleague Dr. Alice Witt from QUT. I'll aim to briefly delve into the concept of citizenship, introduce digital citizenship, and we'll begin to explore the value of critiquing the theory and practice of digital citizenship from a feminist perspective, and what a feminist approach to digital citizenship can help to address. Sorry, Nicole, I can't see my slides, but I'm happy just to keep talking. I might just do that. So interest in citizenship has grown significantly since the early 90s. At its most basic, citizenship is about the individual vis-a-vis their community, and Lister states it describes the relationship between individuals and the state and between individual citizens within that community. And despite this, citizenship remains a highly contested concept with multiple meanings, and it also reflects competing political traditions. It's been subject to criticism, with theorists arguing that citizenship in practice is a site of power and exclusion in which the promise of equal participation and rights conceals the true nature of inequality. In response, some have argued that there's a need to do away with the concept altogether, while others, including feminists such as Rose Neal, argue that the theory and practice of citizenship continues to be a useful way to, and they state, articulate and theorise demands for social, political, economic and cultural change, and to critique the practices and experiences of marginalisation, misrecognition and oppression that continue to condition lives. Next slide. Thank you. So this brings us to the concept of digital citizenship. So we know that digital technologies have led to profound social, economic and political change, and for billions of people around the globe, these technologies play a central role in facilitating a more interconnected global community, serving as counter-public spaces for political activism and social engagement, and for self-exploration, creativity, intimacy, knowledge and business. At its most basic, digital citizenship is concerned, and I'm quoting Mossberger et al. Here, the ability to participate in society online. It's been spoken about, for example, in relation to cyber safety, with a focus on issues such as cyberbullying, sexting and how to be safe online. Other work has focused on digital access and literacy, as well as digital governance. Another key area of focus has been on digital activism, and scholars from the Global South in particular have focused on how people enact their digital citizenship in practice, showing how technologies can be used in the pursuit of advocacy on issues such as gender inequality and for self-expression and representation. So the term is gaining a lot of traction at the moment, and particularly in the context of COVID-19, which has seen a significant number of people working and learning from home around the globe. However, much like citizenship in a more traditional sense, digital citizenship lacks a commonly agreed upon definition and is used widely for different purposes and to refer to different practices. And as we state in our paper, we've come to see it in three main ways. So first, as a status, so what it means to be a citizen. Second, as a practice, what it means to act as a citizen. And finally, as an intersubjective experience, so what it means to occupy the outside, the inside, and the liminal space of citizenship. What is also important to recognise in any discussion of digital citizenship is that the digital realm is not divorced from the from contemporary global challenges, including social inequality, violence, poverty, and that many of these challenges lead to and shape unequal access to technologies, a lack of parity of participation in the digital sphere, and an erosion or denial of digital citizenship. So in terms of critiquing digital citizenship from a feminist perspective, cyber feminists were optimistic about the potential of digital technologies to liberate the gendered body of the physical world. And while many online communities have flourished and digital technologies have been catalysts of social change, the gains have not been evenly distributed, and the utopian ideal of an egalitarian internet hasn't been realised. Inequalities continue to play out in the digital realm. So one example is the digital gender divide, which refers to group differences in access to technology. Only 48% of women worldwide use the internet, and in Australia, gender, affordability and geography are key issues impacting internet use, with newly arrived migrants and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples more likely to be impacted by existing barriers to digital inclusion. Algorithmic bias is also an issue. Scholars have shown that data and algorithms are not neutral, and they promote racist and sexist representations of women and girls. For those who do have access to the internet, technology facilitated abuse, which includes harassment, surveillance, hate speech, threatening messages, image-based sexual abuse and other behaviours, can significantly impact their participation and sense of belonging in a digital world. International studies have shown that online abuse and harassment is a widespread problem, and these acts of everyday aggression play out in different ways and have serious implications for the status and practice of digital citizenship for different groups. The experience can lead to social isolation from friends, family members, the broader community, or communities that people form part of online. And there are also significant impacts on self-determination, autonomy, and a sense of self. So in terms of a feminist approach to digital citizenship, in our article, we suggest that it's critical to examine the ways that inequality and violence hinders active participation in digital life. So we argue that a feminist approach can serve as a valuable lens, first for analysing or critiquing subordination and exclusion in the digital era. So this involves, for instance, looking at the role of the state and corresponding institutions, including internet intermediaries such as digital platforms, and on the structural forces underpinning social inequality, such as neoliberalism, racism, heteronormativity, and sexism. And second, it's valuable as a guide to addressing the deficits of digital citizenship and promoting ways of achieving a radical feminist politics for digital citizenship in practice. There are complexities associated with this, as feminism constitutes diverse perspectives and strategies, and feminists have different theories and solutions to the issue of gender inequality and the problem of citizenship. But I guess rather than viewing this in negative terms, in our article, what we argue is that feminist thinking in all its complexities and diverse forms has a lot to offer the field of digital citizenship. So feminists, including Pateman, for instance, have criticised the theory and practice of citizenship as a site of male power and exclusion. Others, such as Moof, have argued that essentialism and pretensions of universalism serve to conceal the true nature of exclusion. The critique of the public-private divide, as well as the whiteness, maleness, and heteronormativity that is inherent in more traditional conceptions of citizenship, has led to new ways of conceptualizing intimacy. For Haraway, for instance, the cyborg, a fictional being who transcends the physical body, is a useful tool for overhauling and subverting rigid gender roles, enabling people to adopt fluid and multiple identities. Work of this kind provides the critical lens from which to continue to advocate and debate ways to unsettle power hierarchies and to think about transformation and empowerment. Drawing from this in our paper, we suggest that an intersectional, multi-layered feminist approach to digital citizenship offers a valuable way forward. First, an intersectional feminist approach takes greater account of the complexity and structural nature of oppression. As the work of scholars such as Collins and Crenshaw highlights, it provides a way of thinking about how individuals and groups are socially located and how multiple structural inequalities influence experiences of citizenship in practice. Second, the idea of citizenship as plural or multi-layered, and this draws primarily from Yuval Davis's work, provides a useful way to think about where citizenship takes place. It describes the transnational character of social relationships, how these are mediated by digital interactions and infrastructure, and provides a way of thinking about how people's citizenships are impacted by their positionings in different spaces. So thinking about citizenship in anti-essential, non-binary, intersectional terms is not only important for developing critical theory on digital citizenship, but it also has a practical application. So just finally, a feminist approach can, for instance, help to identify and address inequalities in digital access, inform discussions on digital ethics, contribute to existing efforts to democratise technology, which build diversity, and with this, an understanding of discrimination and inequality and its intersections into the design and implementation of policies, codes and practices, including in the AI field, could also inform critiques of digital governance, which includes the roles and responsibilities of online platforms in relation to issues such as technology-facilitated abuse, for instance. So finally, this approach can, and importantly, I should say, this approach can also contribute to a rich understanding of the lived experiences of individuals and groups regarding digital citizenship and offer critical insights into the production, reproduction, and transformation of gender in the digital era. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Steph. Just perfect timing, right on 10 minutes. We'll now pass over to the second speaker, which is Farnoosh Gardari. And Nicole, I believe you've got Farnoosh's slides, so I'll leave it in your capable hands. Thank you so much.
Would it be possible for me to share my slides? Because I have quite a few with photos and then I can just click through them myself.
Is that okay, Nicole?
That's fine. Yep, no problem.
Great, thank you. Right, I'll just be 1 second. Right, hopefully everyone will be able to see the presentation in a second, but before it goes on, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be able to be part of this great event, and I look forward to hearing everyone else's presentations as well as Steph's, who was fantastic. Right, so whilst this is still loading, my presentation today is based on a paper that I wrote after the #MeToo movement happened, and I was quite interested in understanding whether this can be seen as a truly transnational feminist movement or whether it is essentially just another instance of a Western movement taking place and gaining attention for various reasons, but not being able to be truly, transnational in the sense of the inclusion of particularly the Global South as well. So I'll be giving a very brief overview of the #MeToo movement because I think everyone knows it by now. And then I say a few words about digital activism before diving into my understanding of what is transnational feminism and then what is a transnational feminist movement. And then I thought it'd be interesting to look at a more recent manifestation of what I think could also be described as a transnational feminist movement, namely the Chilean dance of Un Violador en tu Camino. So let's start with a very brief overview. #MeToo, as we all know, began with the tweet by Alyssa Milano and went viral through that tweet of if you have been a victim of sexual assault or harassment, tweet. I think it's important to recognize that the actual Me Too kind of movement and the idea behind it came before that in 2006 already by this lady on the photo, Tarana Burke, and it was very much a local grassroots movement that tried to give a space to victims of sexual harassment and sexual abuse, particularly women of color in the US. That kind of tweet, though, then led to this viral movement that we saw in the days after, and it took especially the US, but also European countries in the beginning stages. Interestingly, it then went further and further and further to include not only more countries, but also affect change in a variety of different countries. So Catherine McKinnon, who is obviously a fantastic feminist scholar, but also a lawyer, went so far to recognize how hashtag Me Too and the movement behind it was able to achieve for sexual harassment things that the law unfortunately never was, and legal reform never was able to achieve. So we saw legal reforms coming in the aftermath of the viral movement. The question is to what extent the law will be able to help if it wasn't able to help previously, but it did really lead to these kind of changes and had a effect on societies all over the world that we had not seen in that kind of extent, to that extent before. Now, hashtag Me Too can clearly be classified as an instance of digital activism, right? It's not the first instance. There were many different kind of digital hashtag feminist movements, as they're called, before, where the use of social media facilitated, through becoming viral hashtags, the kind of initiation of a social movement online. Laura Bates' hashtag everyday sexism is an example. We saw different ones, hashtag never been raped, been raped, never reported, a variety of different ones. One of the really important ones that took off in 2015-16 already was hashtag Ni Una Menos in Latin American countries. That was even before hashtag Me Too, just wasn't as, in the West, we didn't see as much of it, probably because it wasn't supported by Hollywood actresses. But so this is not the first instance, right, of hashtag feminism as we see it. When it comes to the question of what sort of feminism do we see happening here when we talk about digital activism and hashtag feminism particularly, there have been quite a few instances of criticism that say, this is still very much an individualistic approach to feminism, right? Especially with regards to hashtag Me Too, there was quite a lot of there were different voices who came to criticize the fact that it is at the end of the day still on the victim to come forward, to tweet, to the emphasis is really on the me in the hashtag Me Too, rather than presenting a kind of collective feminist engagement with the issue of sexual harassment. Now, I think there is some truth to kind of criticizing the potential individuality of digital feminist activism, but I also think it's important to understand that hashtag feminism essentially offers through its coming together of individual voices, the creation of a community. It is an online community, but nonetheless, it is the kind of stepping forward, speaking up in order to create a collective, right? Maybe not as in-person feminist movements have proven to be in the past, but it still presents a sort of collective in my eyes. And I can refer to kind of the analysis of different feminist scholars in this regard that emphasize the way individual stories of oppression, when compiled under one hashtag, demonstrate a collective experience, essentially, right, of structural inequality. And so it is really this interplay of the individual and the collective that comes to light when we speak about hashtag feminism. And we saw that with hashtag Me Too, as we haven't really seen on that scale with any other digital feminist social movement. Now, as I say this, that we can look at this map that I've provided and see that, yes, indeed, it was a rather global movement. We see the variety of different hashtags that came out of it, right? So in different languages around the globe taking place. And that then led individuals to say, well, this is it now, right? After all these years of saying it and saying it again, the sisterhood is now truly global, right? And that kind of takes us back to the approach to global feminism that was especially we saw coming from liberal feminist camps and its origins specifically in the kind of late 70s, early 80s, and the idea of the sisterhood is global movement that really took off and was then replicated also on an international level through international human rights law reform when it comes to women's rights and the rest. So the sisterhood is now finally global, was what some people said with regards to hashtag Me Too, right? We can finally see it. Women all over the world are participating. Yeah, so from my point of view, I have been interested in this idea of global feminism, right? And the universalizing language that has come with the idea of global feminism since the 70s, essentially, and have kind of tried to contrast that with what I understand to be transnational feminism, and the transnational feminism that was especially developed in the 90s by different feminist scholars, particularly Inda Palper-Val and Karen Kaplan. And so for me, global feminism very much represents this idea of a united front of women, the very much use of universalizing language when speaking about the experience of women, and a disregard of not only intersectionality, but also the dominance and hegemony of the West in that. So deep, in my eyes, deeply problematic, and we see that replicated within kind of international human rights law as an example as well. And when we speak about global feminist movements, transnational feminist movements, that's an easy trap that they fall into, right? A dominance of the West, a disregard of other kind of experiences and identities. And one thing that has been emphasized and was emphasized from the very beginning by transnational feminist scholars is this great need for the feminist critique of the Western model of sisterhood in the global context, right? So every time when I hear sisterhood and global sisterhood, that rings a bell for me to you know, is that really, is it again an instance of Western dominance and Western hegemony? And unfortunately, feminism has, feminist theory, feminist practice has often fallen, you know, into this trap. And so to kind of contrast that the idea of global feminism with transnational feminism very much believes in the idea that, you know, not only do we need to problematize theory and practice when it comes to the hegemony of the West, but we also need to understand how is it possible to do feminist work across cultural divides, right? Because it must be possible to have a transnational feminist movement. The question is just how do we do it? And one of the ways that I think has been working in order to take a kind of create a transnational movement has been through the contextualization of different things in individual localities, right? And so if I can just demonstrate that through #MeToo, it very much started off as a Hollywood elite kind of experience and was then replicated, as I said, throughout the world. But it wasn't only that we saw the #MeToo being used, whether it's in its different kind of translations or as #MeToo around the world, but we saw different kinds of manifestation of that hashtag occurring around the world. So one example that I think stands out and we saw its adaptation was #MosqueMeToo, where Muslim women all over the world used this #MosqueMeToo to draw attention to their experiences of sexual harassment when it comes to the Hajj or other kind of religious encounters, right? So we see that taking this hashtag, right, the digital activism that did originate as a kind of Western, especially US experience, but then it's adapted and contextualized as with regards to the specific experiences, as in this instance, Muslim women, right? And then this continued to go on, and we saw we saw different variations of it, whether it's to do with locality or whether we, as in this instance of #MeQueer with identity, right? So #MeQueer was another kind of adaptation of it that catered to a specific identity and experience of a different community. And we saw that contextualized within that, drawing attention to sexual assault, harassment, and violence that the queer community encountered because they were queer, right? And so these kind of different kinds of adaptations, there's many different examples, right? There's #Kutu that was used with regards to having to wear heels in Japan when you go to work. Most recently, last year, there was hashtag Masaktaj in Morocco after an instance of a young woman being raped and sexually assaulted. And the kind of organizer specifically referred to hashtag #MeToo as something that they saw as an opportunity to take advantage of, but at the same time adapted to their context. So these different kinds of manifestations, as we see them being contextualized in different localities, but also in accordance with different kind of intersectional identities, is what I thought was indicative of hashtag #MeToo having the potential of being a transnational feminist movement, rather than falling into the traps of the global sisterhood fantasy, right? And that kind of goes back to this question of, you know, that I think is at the end of the day what we need to really be concerned with, and how do we understand the production and reception of diverse feminisms within a framework of transnational social, cultural, economic movements. And just really brief, because I know I'm running out, running out of time. The recent phenomenon of in Chile that came in 2000, towards the end of 2019, and became really famous, the song of Un Violador en tu Camino, is another one of these examples of how something can originate in a locality. Idea, and this is, in my eyes, wonderful that it didn't even originate in the West, right? It came from a small intersectional anti-colonial feminist collective in Chile. What more can you want? And then it spread globally, right? And this is Las Tres, the feminist collective. And then it spread locally, right? And we saw it spread locally, not only in its use of the same song in a variety of different localities, but we also saw its adaptation in two different contexts and the issues that different localities encountered, right? So in India, they used it, for example, after the kind of sexual assault and murder of a young woman, and then the organizers used this kind of momentum of this song from Chile, adapted it to draw attention to the issues that that women face in India when it comes to sexual violence, right? And they adapted the lyrics. So in India, they said, in the name of the caste, in the name of religion, we disappear, we are exploited, we carry the worst part of rape and violence on our bodies, but with the same kind of performance that they used in Chile. We saw it in New York outside the courthouse in an English version when Harvey Weinstein was being prosecuted. And we saw it in the Turkish parliament as a way of drawing attention to femicide in Turkey, and the treatment of Turkish protesters, female protesters, by the police. So all of these different adaptations again demonstrate that there is this potential for transnational feminist movements that comes out of digital activism that might start in one locality, but then can be contextualized in order to demonstrate the experiences and identities of a wider audience. Right, I think that I'll stop there so I don't abuse my privileges. And thank you very much. I look forward to hearing your comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Farnoosh. That was great. I'll now invite our next speaker, Dr. Bianca Farley-Bourne.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. So I'd like to start by acknowledging that I am joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to extend my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So I'd also like to acknowledge that this has been an incredibly difficult week or few weeks for survivors in Australia. So I'm going to be speaking briefly today around the possibilities and the limits of social and digital media as sites of potential justice and activism around sexual violence. Nicole, I can't actually see my slides yet either, so if it's easier, I can also share them. Oh, here we go. Thank you. I might just click to thank you, the next one. So I was also going to use Me Too and hopefully, if I don't run out of time, the current allegations of sexual violence against our Attorney General, Christian Porter, as key case studies. So I was going to give you some background to Me Too, but thankfully Farnoosh has already done that, so I can skip over that and save a little bit of time. Again, I know most of you will be intimately familiar with the Me Too movement. We're well aware that millions of people use this hashtag in the first 24 hours, and it's undeniably sparked a sustained global conversation on sexual violence. I think the phrase "Me Too" is now embedded within our lexicon around sexual violence. And it, of course, also sparked, many local campaigns across the globe, and was taken up by local activists in a range of quite creative ways to promote and to push local political agendas. I'd also like to reiterate, Farnoosh touched on this briefly as well, that Me Too itself didn't kind of come from nowhere. I think it tends to be treated as though it was the kind of first time we've seen this type of activism. So myself and some colleagues have recently argued in a publication in Feminist Media Studies that Me Too itself has to be understood as having been made possible by both earlier feminist digital activism on sexual violence, and Farnoosh gave a few examples of some of those hashtag campaigns, but also as by decades of feminist activism more broadly, so really stemming from the second wave of the feminist movement and the emphasis on sexual and gender-based violence within that. So I think this history of activism tends to be erased when we're talking about the Me Too movement. And I think we can understand that erasure itself as a form of epistemic injustice. Okay, so in thinking about or understanding the potential of digital spaces and social media to function as sites of justice, I think we really have to situate this within the widespread injustice that survivors are facing within our criminal justice system and other mainstream institutions. And we also need to situate this within an understanding of victim survivors' justice needs. So in terms of the limitations of the criminal justice system, again, I think most people will be very well aware of what some of the issues are. So we know that in spite of decades of, in some cases, quite progressive reforms to legislation and to practices in different jurisdictions across Australia, we know that the vast majority of survivors still don't report to the system. So around 87% of survivors never report to the police. We know that for those who do report, they continue to experience the criminal justice system as a site of traumatization or re-traumatization and a site of invalidation of their experiences. And of course, we know that the vast majority of cases are filtered out of the criminal justice system before they make it to court. So that's just a snapshot of some of the issues, but just to reiterate that we're very well aware that the mainstream criminal justice system does not function as a site of justice for the vast majority of survivors, and in many cases is actively a site of injustice and perpetuates trauma and harm against survivors. So we've also seen a body of research emerge looking at survivors' justice needs. So this has been led by people like Claire McGlynn in the UK and Kathy Daly in Australia. And this looks at what do survivors actually need to happen to feel as though a sense of justice has been achieved in response to their experiences. And this work has really shown that survivors have a diverse range of justice needs. So some of the more common needs include things like giving voice to their experience, so talking about what happened in their own words and in a way that's meaningful to them, and in a forum where what they say is heard and taken seriously. We know that being believed and validated are really essential for many survivors, having their perpetrator held to account in some way, and also community protection, and particularly the protection of other women or people who might be vulnerable to perpetration. So certainly some of these needs can be met through the mainstream criminal justice system, although this is often not the case, as I've just established. But arguably, these are also things that can potentially be achieved through social media or through other informal and innovative justice mechanisms. So I think the Me Too movement provides a really clear example of both the potentials, but also some of the limitations of social media as a site of justice for victim survivors. So I think we saw in Me Too that, clearly it did give voice to many survivors, if not millions of survivors' experiences, and it did foster a context where survivors were perhaps more likely to be supported and believed than they otherwise would have been. And this was something that I think was really enabled by the ability of social media to create networked communities and countercultural spaces that are able to challenge the mainstream or dominant norms and discursive construction of sexual violence. I think the other thing that was really central here was the ability of social media to enable mass disclosure. So although it was, obviously reliant on individual survivors coming forward, these collective disclosures worked to create a community of practice and support. Arguably, we did also see some tangible outcomes for at least some victim survivors, although I think this was relatively rare. So, of course, Harvey Weinstein was successfully convicted and jailed. We also saw the Australian Human Rights Commission national inquiry into workplace sexual harassment launched in Australia as a direct result of the Me Too movement. So although that does illustrate some of the ways in which social media was able to foster perhaps some sense of justice or to meet some survivors' justice needs, I think it's also fair to say that there are significant limitations and challenges associated with the use of social media to achieve justice. So I think the first and perhaps the most central question is who can actually speak out online. So is everyone given the same platform, the same ability to be heard and to be validated? And of course, I would suggest no. So, we know perhaps at the most basic level that not all women have or survivors have access to social media, and there is a continued divide, particularly across the global now, north and south. We know that social media is often a site of erasure, particularly for people of colour, transgender people, people with disabilities, and so forth. Particularly within feminist spaces online, I would suggest that these are currently incredibly hostile towards trans people and particularly trans women. So there were very real questions about who is able to participate within digital spaces and to be heard, and whether digital spaces actually continue to function as a site of both erasure but also active harm against certain communities. I think there's also an important critique around the politics of speaking out, and I'm drawing particularly on Tanya Sarisia's work here. So we've seen decades of survivors speaking out about their experiences and giving voice and breaking the silence. And of course, this is incredibly important for a range of ways, and I don't mean to dismiss survivors who have spoken out, but at the same time, we have it's arguably apparent that this has not been sufficient to generate structural change in and of itself. I think we've seen this quite recently with the events in the Australian Parliament, that survivors speaking out can, often be ignored or dismissed. This type of speaking out can also tend to emphasize the performance of trauma as well, rather than focusing on generating structural, social, and cultural change. And finally, we know that digital spaces are often sites of violence in and of themselves, something that's illustrated through the work that Nicola Henry has done with her colleagues. So disclosure might be met with, abuse or additional forms of violence. So it's not always a safe space for survivors to be disclosing or speaking out. Okay, can we just move to the next slide, please, Nicole? So I know I'm rapidly running out of time, but I do really want to quickly touch on the recent events in Parliament in Australia, particularly given these have really been heralded as, Australia's Me Too movement, but they also provide, I think, quite a compelling example of some of, again, the potentials and limitations of digital justice. So in the case of Christian Porter and the Liberal government's response to the allegations of rape and sexual violence that have been made against him, I think we've seen what Mendes and colleagues have called the platform vernaculars of social media, and particularly Twitter being used in a number of ways. So by platform vernaculars, referring to the ways in which activists and survivors have been able to draw on the language and dominant discursive practices of social media to speak out and to challenge, again, those dominant institutional responses. So in the last few weeks, we've seen the feminist group, who are called the Mad Fucking Witches, apologies for the swear, coined the hashtag Dutton is a rape apologist in response to comments that Dutton made again, in relation to the allegations against Christian Porter that were simply a case of, he said, she said. We also saw Twitter being used to identify and out Christian Porter as the cabinet rapist before his public announcement. And we saw Twitter users drawing on humour as a form of subversion and wordplay to name and shame him without actually using his name. There's a great example of this just down here. And finally, what was that? I need to wrap it up. Okay, I'm not quite sure. Just finally, we also saw Kate McCartney and Kate McLennan released a short video on acting and crying when you don't feel any emotional connection with what you're saying, which was a fantastic critique and send up of Christian Porter's emotional press conference, suggesting that the emotion that he displayed was largely an act put on to foster or garner sympathy. So I think all of these examples, all of which went viral, were working to challenge rape culture and to challenge the actions of perpetrators and also the institutions that were supporting them by publicly exposing them and exposing how they might be seeking to manipulate sympathy from others. However, arguably and very quickly in this case, there is arguably no real justice to be achieved. We know that the government has refused to take any tangible action to investigate Porter or hold him to account in any way. So I think at best, this activism could be thought of as perhaps an approximation of justice in the face of a government and criminal justice system that has been unwilling or unable to take action in this case. And I think more importantly, we know that the survivor in this case has very sadly committed suicide, meaning that she is not here to be believed, to have her experience validated by others, or to ever see her perpetrator held to account for his actions. So I think in this case, justice is an impossibility. Thank you. Sorry for going slightly over time.
No worries. Thank you so much, Bianca. That was also really great. And yeah, it was just great to hear you speak, so I didn't want to cut you off there. We will take a break after our next speaker for a few minutes so people can go to the bathroom and get a cup of tea. But before we do so, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Jenny Kennedy. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you. And to say, Nicola, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this panel. I don't have slides, I'll just be talking. And also, before I begin, I would too like to acknowledge the traditional custodians and ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia, where we continue to write, think, teach and learn. And especially to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and the Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin nations, on whose lands I live and work and whose land was stolen and never ceded. I'm going to talk today, give you a bit of an overview and some of the work that I've been focused on the last couple of years, which is on the gendering of the types of devices that we are living with, voice assistants, and do a little kind of mention of this book, The Smart Wife, that came out late last year, that I had the joy of working on with a great friend and colleague, Yolandi Strengers. And I thought, rather than paraphrase the work that we did, I would just actually read you the opening para of the book and then use that as a launch point to make a couple of points that I want to make about the current kind of gender disparity in the tech industry. So it's been a busy day. You're tired, sore and hungry. All you want to do is put your feet up, stream your favourite on-demand show and pour yourself a glass of wine. But there's still dinner to cook, homework to supervise and tomorrow's schedule to finalise. Someone should probably do a load of laundry and you need to put the garbage out. And if this could all happen without any drama, with all household members amicably carrying out their chores, well, wouldn't that be nice? You might also want someone to talk with and ask how your day was. Maybe you even desire something a little extra. If only there was someone or something that could do it all. Meet the Smart Wife. She's pleasant, helpful and available at an increasingly affordable price. Millions of people from around the world are now turning to connected and robotic devices to provide the domestic, caring and intimacy services historically delivered by real-life wives. The Smart Wife comes in many forms. In fact, chances are you're already living with her. The most obvious are assistants such as Amazon's Alexa, Apple's Siri or Google Home, which have default female voices in most markets in which they are sold. The Smart Wife, by smart we mean AI, internet connected or robotic things. By wife, we refer to an enduring archetype in the collective psyche, one who can take on all forms of domestic work within the home. In the past and present, and at her most reduced, a wife has been both social construct and commodity, and viewed as the property of a man. Her roles include that of caregiver, housekeeper, homemaker, emotional labourer, provider of sexual services and procreator of legitimate offspring. And these roles are entrenched in thousands of years of patriarchy. The Smart Wife is figurative, not literal, although there are some examples of people actually marrying their smart wives, which we do get to in the book. But we use the term the Smart Wife to encompass smart technology intended to carry out domestic labours traditionally associated with the wife's role and with any smart technology that is able to be treated as a smart wife by those who interact with her. In addition, our team encompasses the feminised, humanoid or artificial sentient beings playing wifely roles in many popular sci-fi and media texts. And these provide the role models for the designed smart wives. So we set up the kind of, it's a sort of a playful kind of idea of this smart wife in terms of what are these kind of devices that we're increasingly living with imagined to be. And there's three kind of key points that I want to make about this that I think relate to the topics of this panel. So the first is that we have a tendency to humanize devices and to ascribe social structures onto devices, especially gendered structures onto them. And these then tend to inform our experiences of how we engage and understand gender in our day-to-day life. So the way that these feminized devices are being constructed in our home is really important for thinking about basically how we are responding and interacting with gendered constructs. And the fact that they're in our homes as well, in our intimate spaces. And I think with COVID as well, we are increasingly spending time with our homes and increasingly spending time engaging with these devices. So they come to they mimic our human interaction, but in many ways they come to stand in for human interaction as well. The second point is to think about who these devices are being designed by. Now, there's a number of key media organisations, global corporations that are producing these, and the vast majority of the workers in those spaces are male. Female participation in computer science studies in universities and related work is actually going backwards and not forwards. For example, in the US in the 80s, 37% of computer science graduates were female, but by 2016 that has gone down to only 18%. This kind of gender disparity actually gets worse in fields of artificial intelligence, automation, and voice assistance. So the types of technologies that we're increasingly engaging with are increasingly being designed by men and not by a more diverse range of people. And this also impacts who these devices are being designed for. They're being designed overwhelmingly by men and overwhelmingly for men. So the idea of being able to design a device that can provide any kind, like some form of domestic or even emotional labour, has a number of consequences. It tends to try to obscure or overlook how we should value these kinds of labours. If we can displace them onto a machine, it doesn't cause us to address actually how we currently value those labours in our society. And again, like related to COVID and the global pandemic, the reports in terms of who has taken up the bulk of the home labour and the homeschooling, in addition to professional workloads, has overwhelmingly been to women. There's also the final concern is that one of the major selling points of a lot of these smart technologies is around opportunities for control. So inviting control of your domain, that you can check into cameras, to microphones, the idea that you're protecting, the man is protecting the kind of assets within the house from some unknown intruder, some external force. But what happens is there tends to be a tech guru or digital housekeeper that is mostly responsible for the researching, the selecting, and then the setting up of these devices into the home. And there's often a gender disparity in that, which is one of the things that Yolandi and I separately uncovered in our, we did separate fieldwork, which was what brought us together actually to write this book, was acknowledging the disparities in terms of the kinds of work that went into the home versus the kind of work that went into setting up technology in the home, and how that was never classed as housework, but often used to detract from people's time to do housework and was prioritised as being a special interest. But it means that not everyone in a household tends to have the same degree of control over the devices that are being used in their homes. And this has very serious consequences for issues of domestic violence. There's increasing rates of smart home devices being used in some form of coercive or controlling situations, or in order to spy on people within the home. And this is another, I think this can all be linked to the kinds of experiences that are prioritised in the design of these such devices. So one of the main purposes of the book has been to highlight some of these decisions that are taking place, and to suggest some way forward. So we finish with a chapter on with some proposals of where we would like to see the smart home industry going, but also where we would like to see our own engagement with this technology and some ways forward. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you, Jenny. That was excellent, and thank you to all four panellists for amazing presentations. I really enjoyed all four of you speaking today. We're going to take a 5-minute break just to give everyone a bit of a breather. It's quite a heavy topic today. So we'll come back in 5 minutes and we'll commence the panel discussion at that point. Okay, we're back. So we'll start the panel discussion now. I'll start with the first question, and then I'll offer the panelists an opportunity to respond, and then depending on time, I'll ask another question or we'll open up to the audience to ask questions. For the audience, you're welcome to turn your cameras on now, or you're welcome to leave them off. I'll leave that up to you. When it does come time for questions, you're welcome to turn your cameras on and obviously unmute yourselves. You're also welcome to post questions in the chat for any of the four speakers or to the panel as a whole. So let me start by again saying thank you so much to all four of you. I'm so pleased with how that went. I thought it was just brilliant, and when you're organising these things, it's really great when you've got four amazing speakers. So thank you, and I know the audience likewise found it really enlightening and really interesting. So my question relates to leadership. As you know, the theme for International Women's Day this year is Women in Leadership, Achieving an Equal Future in a COVID-19 World. So this is a question for all four panelists. What, in your view, and I know this is a really hard question, I'm sorry, but what in your view does good leadership entail in terms of addressing gender inequality in a digital COVID-19 era? And will this make a difference?
I mean, I'm happy to go first. I have some vague thoughts, possibly incoherent. It is a really difficult question. I mean, I think, I have a few basic ideas of things that leaders should be doing in response to gender-based violence. I mean, I think the first is responding in a consistent way that consistently takes seriously disclosures of gender-based violence, regardless of who the alleged perpetrator is. And I think that's something we have seen a complete absence of in the last few weeks. I think we've seen a continued willingness of people in positions of power to excuse, minimize the actions of perpetrators, and essentially to continue to support and uphold men who have been accused of sexual violence who are in positions of power. So I think there's a need for our leaders to be bold and fearless regardless of who the perpetrator is, or the alleged perpetrator, I should say, sorry, and to take appropriate action, to take it seriously, to be willing to at least, at the very least, investigate what's happened. I think as well, good leadership, particularly from those who are in our parliament, should be reflected in taking serious, tangible and, structural action. And again, I think that's something that we've seen a complete absence of in Australia. So yeah, that's my brief rant. Thank you for listening to my TED talk, everyone. I'll let someone else talk.
I'm happy to just make a few comments in that regard. Very simple. I think when we speak about gender equality and leadership that can further that, it has to be in this day and age anti-racist and anti-colonial and intersectional. And if it can't be that, then that's doing nothing in my eyes for gender equality either. After decades and decades of trying out different approaches to feminism, if we still can't understand that those are necessary requirements, then that's a failure on our behalf, I think.
Jenny or Steph?
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you.
just really quickly just want to echo exactly what Bianca and Finosh have said. And I think just my reflections on the past couple of weeks is just thinking about the who of leadership. So thinking about who's in those positions of power and, thinking about positionality and their own experiences and whose experiences are being represented. And I think that goes to what you're saying, Finosh. I think that speaks volumes. So, yeah.
Thanks, Steph.
Yeah, I mean, like it's I don't even know where to start. It's a really difficult question, but I echo everything that's being said in terms of the necessity, I think, like for leadership to have consistent and transparent due processes that are, as you say, irrelevant of who is in that process, and also that leadership needs to be representative of who is engaged in that structure, and that's not something that we have ever seen, especially in Australian politics.
Thank you. I'll now open it up to the audience because we only have just under 15 minutes left. As I said, feel free to turn your camera on if you want to ask a question or to post a question in the chat.
Maybe I can ask a question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
I have, so I'm a lawyer, right? So I'm interested in feminism and transnational feminist movements, but the kind of whole digital sphere is very new to me, and my interest in social movements is what's brought me to the digital sphere. But something that's been fascinating for me since I started doing kind of feminist theory and the interaction of law, but feminist theory more generally, is now this interaction between feminism and AI and the algorithms and all that comes with it. I find it I don't know much about it, but I find it fascinating. So your different contributions on it were fantastic. And something stood out that Jenny said, and you said that AI was made by men for men. And that's something that I say to my law students whenever I start a feminist legal theory class. The law was always made by men for men, right? And so you already see these parallels. And so one of the things that we say is we need to interrogate what are the gender biases and how can we reform the law. And I was wondering, is law maybe not the right approach sometimes? And so I was wondering what your thought behind this, what is your approach? Is it that we need to reform AI and make it more accessible to kind of the audiences and the individuals who program it and create it? Or is it that maybe the kind of approach to AI as a whole is a flawed one, as sometimes that's what I think about the law?
I mean, I'll start. Yeah, I think, Vanisha, I think we're already starting with a flawed system in that there are biases now within that system that are practically impossible to sort of get rid of. And so we're now having to work within that. I mean, so there is, there's fantastic work being done that is drawing attention to the many different intersectional biases that are already built into those systems. And that's one important step, is when we can identify those biases, we can start to address those biases. And then the next stage is that I think needs to work concurrently is trying to prevent that happening any further. And the way we do that is think about, like, for example, who is in leadership in these corporations? Who is leading the development of AIs? What perspectives and knowledge and experiences do they bring to that? Or do they draw on from that? Or are they able to build within their team? And it's making sure that there is more diversity in those teams from the beginning, that then I think we have hope of building systems that don't have so many the issues that we currently have. And that's what, I think although we already have, I mean, we're talking about really decades and decades of IT systems that are biased. But the kind of the rapid growth that's happening right now, I think we're at an exciting opportunity point where difference could be made, and I want to see that happen.
Thank you.
There's a couple of questions now from the panelists. So the first one's from Emma. Her question is, where do we think Me Too will go from here?
I can say a few words about my thoughts. So as I kind of scraped really just the surface on, Me Too did lead to some kind of changes within legal frameworks, within, you know, getting rid of a few male figures in top positions and the rest of it. Not nearly as much as obviously we all would hope for, but we saw some changes that, you know, we don't see that often happening with kind of Twitter hashtags, right? But the problem that I have with that, and that goes back to what I just said about the law, is sometimes legal reform, and especially when it comes to sexual violence and criminal offences in that kind of sphere, legal reform is just not sufficient, right? So the next step then is if the law has not been catering to what we need and to what victims of sexual violence need so far, then is legal reform going to be the solution? Most likely not, right? And then the next step is what do we need? And I think with so many topics that we are interested in and try to work on when it comes to gender equality, it is that shift within society and within the minds of individuals that we need, and education is at the forefront of it, right? And a kind of understanding of the deeply patriarchal structures within our societies and how they perpetuate again and again and again over the years. But we don't see that happening, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the consequences of #MeToo and other kind of digital feminist movements that I've come across, as picked up by the powerful, right, have been a superficial interaction with these issues, and not the kind of more deeply engaged feminist engagement that we would want to see. But that's not as an excuse to say it, but that's just the norm, right? Whatever issue it is that is brought to the attention of politicians, of those with legislative power, by the media and other ways that you can gain their attention, is dealt with as, oh yes, now it's very important, and then we do a few minor changes and it's forgotten. But I do think that we see the good thing about Me Too is that we do see it being picked up again and again and again in different localities, still being used today, right? And we see the kind of, I think the boom with Me Too that came through the idea of Twitter and digital activism for feminist purposes, we now see being replicated in a variety of instances. And so that's a positive, at least.
Yeah, I guess just to add quickly to that, I mean, I think firstly, like Me Too itself was quite a fragmented movement, and it was never really clear what the aims of the movement were, if it even had any. So, you know, asking what comes next can be difficult, because it's kind of like, well, what was it trying to achieve beyond, you know, survivors saying, yes, Me Too in the first place. That said, I think, yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Fanush has just said. I think the thing I would add, I would love to see a much greater focus on an intersectional approach to sexual violence. I think the dominant framing within Me Too has still been very much focused on, white cisgender middle class women within the global north. So, a movement that's much able to grapple with the diversity and breadth of experiences of sexual violence, I think, is sorely needed. The second thing, and I think this aligns with what Fanush is saying, I would really like to see a much stronger focus on transformative justice and the development of justice responses outside of that mainstream criminal justice system. You know, we've seen, I mean, there's currently a review underway in Victoria, and we've seen recent reviews of sexual offences legislation in, New South Wales and Queensland that have made some, pretty disappointing recommendations for change. I'm basically at a point where I think, why do we keep going back to the same system that has routinely failed survivors and expect it to give us something different? Like, it's just not going to happen. I think we need to start looking for forms of justice outside of that mainstream system, and we need to be thinking about, I mean, this is radical me, but how do we tear it all down and start again, basically,
We've got a couple of other questions, so I might move on to them. This is from Ruth. She says, I'm investigating the uses of true crime podcasts and wondering if this proliferation of women's storytelling can be seen as a form of digital activism with the potential to change or bring justice and create a collective voice.
Great question, Ruth, and that sounds like a fascinating project. I look forward to seeing what comes out of it. I mean, I think absolutely it can be viewed as a form of activism. I mean, of course, it depends on how the particular podcasts are framing sexual violence and what sort of outcomes they're asking for or demanding. I think one risk is that, like I say, just telling stories, but it can run the risk of almost being a bit voyeuristic, I guess, without necessarily seeking to generate change. But absolutely, I think that form of storytelling can be fundamentally important in helping people to understand the issue, in giving voice to survivors, in validating people's experiences. All of those things can absolutely be achieved through survivors speaking out and sharing their experiences. I think that can be really important. I think where it again becomes tricky is that speaking out isn't always sufficient to generate that kind of structural and broader change, and there is a real challenge around how do we leverage those voices to generate the change that we need, and how do we make sure that we're not falling into the trap of, again, that kind of performance of trauma and expecting individual survivors to speak out again and again and again and sharing their stories without it necessarily being heard in the way that we might like. I don't have suggestions as to how we actually achieve that. I'm just here to ask the difficult questions.
We're going to move on just quickly. We've got two more questions, and I'm sorry, we'll have to kind of end it at those two questions. And if we can just get quick responses from the panel, if that's okay. The second to last question comes from, hold on, where is it? From Lily. As a young female, what are the ways that I can become more educated about transnational feminism and widen my exposure outside of solely Western media dominating online feminist movements?
I can say a few words. So one thing that I have been trying to do myself, because it's, you don't know, I didn't know, that whatever I was given during my university studies to read was predominantly written by, not only males, yeah, we all knew that, but also by white European males, right? And that is deeply problematic. And I think as educators, we have an obligation to rectify that. And so what I've tried to do is, let's say I'm interested about my research at the moment, predominantly focus on Afghan women, right, and how they use international human rights for their own purposes in Afghanistan. So what I've tried to do throughout this is read sources by Afghan women, right? Read sources by Afghan organizations, read sources by Afghan researchers, rather than go to the kind of European equivalent of that. So I think one way of trying to approach it is to really go to the different kind of localities that you're interested in, the different kind of identities that you're interested in, right? And taking that intersectional approach and reading your way through that, because there are more and more resources, thankfully. One of the, maybe not many positives, but one of the positives of globalization is that we are interconnected and more people have a platform to speak out on. And so there is more books, there's more articles, there's more organizations, right, that you can now read their stuff. And that's something that's helped me a lot, to be able to listen and listen and read from a wider audience, rather than just the ones that are often given to us by our institutions, unfortunately. And also demanded from your educators, right? If you are still a student, you should speak up and say, I want this, because that's what universities say, right? Universities want to give you, the customer, what you want, and sometimes they listen to you more than they listen to us as educators. So you also have power in that sense.
And I might just invite Steph. I know Steph's doing an amazing PhD looking at intersectionality and migrant women's experiences in the Australian context. Steph, just very quickly, I know there's some authors that you cite heavily in your work that have been really influential in shaping the way in which you think about intersectionality.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And I just have to echo what Vanusha said again, but I think for me, not only in reading the works of scholars, but also thinking about how activism operates at the community level. What I found, at least in my research, but there's a lot of activism and advocacy going on in different spaces that's really localized, and often groups will generate their own research and papers, and there's just such a wealth of information, particularly in the grassroots or community sector. So the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, Adele Maderla, and some of their other researchers, I think their work is it's on the front line of doing intersectional work in practice, and it's just really, really useful and a really valuable way to think about not just the theory of working in an intersectional way, but also the practice. And I think for me, at least, those more, frequently cited authors, Chandra Mohanty and Patricia Hill Collins and Kimberly Crenshaw's work, I think going back to kind of those key texts can be really, really instructive, and at least had a huge influence on me. And sometimes it takes 5, 6, 7 reads at a time at different, across a period of time. But yeah, just reading and listening as much as you can.
Thank you. I'm very sorry to the other members of the audience who did have questions. We have run out of time, unfortunately. I do want to say, first of all, a big thank you to Nicole Woodham and Chad O'Brien and Renata Kokonovich for setting up this event today, and for doing such a great job and helping me to organise the event. Oh, Bianca, I like that clap. I haven't seen that before. And lastly, but not least, I would like to before I do that, thank the audience. It's been great to get your questions and great for you to come along today. And last but not least, thank you so much to the 4 panelists, particularly you, Fanush, for staying up so late at night in the UK. But I really enjoyed today's event. I thought you were all brilliant and I learned so much, and thank you very much.